I'm very pleased to see this effort on Bharat Prabha because it will hopefully trigger a conversation, a more serious conversation, as well as trigger a consciousness in India about our maritime lineage. One of the strange things of India is that we are the only country in the world after whom an ocean is named, the Indian Ocean. Yet our mental outlook, despite this large coastline and as I will show you, a very long maritime history, our mental outlook, unfortunately, is entirely landlocked. We tend to have a very continental view. It may be partly because our capital happens to be in Delhi, but in every sphere of activity, our mindset tends to be continental. I can see a lot of friends here from the Navy. I know they'll appreciate my saying this, but even our defense policy tends to be continental. When we think of our neighbors, we think of our friendly neighbor to the west and another friendly neighbor to the north. But the fact is, if you take a maritime perspective, we have many other neighbors as well. We have Indonesia as a neighbor, the entire east coast of Africa is a neighbor, even Australia is a neighbor. People very often forget that Australia is actually an Indian Ocean country as much as it is a Pacific country. And of course, the entire Gulf is our neighbor. And not something I'm just saying because it happens to be a geographical fact and it sounds good in a speech. Our entire history is actually largely driven by maritime concerns rather than continental concerns. Again, sadly, the way our textbooks are written gives you a very continental, landlocked view of our history, mostly about Delhi. But in fact, if you take a wider view of history, you will see that going back 5,000 years back, the ports of the Indus-Saraswati civilization had close links to the Sumerian civilization, the Egyptians, and so on. So if you go to the Gulf today, you'll see large numbers of Indians living there. It turns out that 5,000 years ago, there were Indians living in enclaves in and around Sumerian cities. And the Sumerians have left us records of people coming from a land they used to then call Meluha to trade, bringing what are obviously Indian products, cotton cloth, ivory, peacocks, and so on. Now, it may find you some interesting that the very first record of an Indian anywhere in the world is actually from Sumeria. It's a court case in which an Indian had punched a local and broken his tooth in a drunken brawl. So it's quite possible that's the source of prohibition in Gujarat. Now, the point is that this long history does not end with that early phase. It carries on throughout our long history. So there were ports all along the west coast of India. One of the most famous ports of ancient world was Muziris, or what we call Muchiripatnam, now in Kerala. And there are records of hundreds of ships going both ways, Roman and Greek ships coming to trade in India and Indian ships going to the ports on the Red Sea or going to the Persian Gulf and so on. And it is also true of the other coast. You had ships from Odisha, Bengal, from Andhra, Tamil coast, sailing initially along the coast to Thailand and then to Vietnam. But after the 2nd, 3rd century AD, they were quite happily figured out how the monsoon winds worked, and they were sailing out to Indonesia and further out all the way through to Japan and Korea and so on. This is the reason you see such a lot of Indian influence in Southeast Asia and even further out to East Asia. The largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia, Angkor Wat. Korean history begins with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from, guess where? Ayodhya. All of this was done through maritime linkages, not through land linkages. There were land linkages too. There were scholars coming from, for example, China to study in Nalanda. But do remember that many of them either came by or went back by the maritime route, like Fahyan, for example. Similarly, much of the upkeep of Nalanda, by the way, was funded by the kings of Srivijaya, which is now we know as Sumatra. So there is a lot of ancient linkages that remained in the world, and these linkages are still alive to today. After all, Singapore is called Singhapura, the lion city. Indonesia calls itself Indonesia after us, our country. Their currency is called the rupiah. Their national symbol is the Garuda of Vishnu, even though it's a Muslim majority country. The point I'm making is that these maritime linkages are powerful. They're alive in many cultural aspects in many parts of the world. Even today, they are alive in our cultural aspects. For example, the biggest festival that happens in Odisha happens on Kartik Purnima. And on Kartik Purnima, which happens in November, the custom is that the women, mostly women, but others as well, go out to a water body and put a small paper boat with a lamp in it. So what are they actually doing? What they're actually doing is they're reenacting ancient times when ships from Odisha would sail out to Indonesia at this time of the year, because this is the time of the year when the winds stop blowing from south to north and begin blowing north to south. So they would use these winds to sail out to Indonesia. And concurrent to this, there is actually in Cuttack a huge fair called Bali Jatra, which literally means the voyage to Bali. So all of these are still alive. The good news is that this, after many centuries of not giving too much emphasis on our maritime past, there's been a recent revival of interest in these issues. And you have, for example, a project, some of you may find interesting to know, of building an ancient ship using a 2,000-year-old design of stitched shipping is being built with the help of the Indian Navy and the Ministry of Culture, and some help from the Ministry of Shipping as well. And the idea is to sail this wooden ship, about 20-meter long wooden ship, built by this ancient model design from Konarak and sail it all the way to Bali. So this project is being put together, and it was announced a few months ago. And so we hope that in a year or so, or 2 years from now, we'll have a ship and we'll be able to carry this out as a good adventure. And this fits into what is being attempted here at Bharat Prabha, which is to create a maritime shipping consciousness in this country, because as I said, for a variety of reasons, we have got almost think of, say, a ministry like shipping as being sort of an add-on ministry, an infrastructure ministry, whereas in fact, it is not. It's very much a part of who we are. As I said, just look at a map of our country. We've got one of the longest coastlines in the world. We already are the 5th largest economy in the world. We aspire to be the 3rd largest economy in the world by the end of the decade. This will not work until we can make our sea lanes work, our ports work. This will not work until we can project power in our Indian Ocean region. This will not work until we essentially are able to turn the Indian Ocean as being a rival to the Pacific Rim as an engine of growth. So all of this requires having a maritime worldview, which I'm glad that finally a lot of attention is being given, and this event today is to get not just the policymakers, but to get a wider community to be created, whether it's academics or younger people, and the wider community of ecosystem where there is a culture of thinking about things in a maritime way. Of course, I've talked mostly about the seas, but of course, the waterways have been also integral to transportation inside the country. If you read some of our ancient texts, there is lots of mention of people sailing up and down the Ganga, for example, all the way to Allahabad or even beyond. In fact, I don't know if you are aware that when during Mughal times, the main gates that were used by the Mughal emperors to enter Delhi were not the grand gates you see on the landward side, which you may think is the way they went in and out of the city. In fact, they used to entirely go up and down between Agra and Delhi by boat. So the real entrance is the one that is unfortunately now landlocked and far away from the river. But that was the main gate that Shah Jahan would have used when he came to the new city of Shah Jahanabad. He came up from Agra by boat, and the main gate is now all filled up with earth. But that was in fact the main gate. That's why you see all the main palace buildings are all along on the river side, because that is the real side of the river that the emperor himself would have seen first and interacted with. So now, before I end, let me say that given that these issues are up and running, and Mr. Gopal Krishna told us about 4 topics that he talked about that we need to take into account. Let me add one more. Since I have been the advocate of building an ancient ship, let me say that I am also an advocate of building new ships. We have created a fair amount of capacity in India to build top-notch warships, but in fact, we have the capacity, technological capacity, of becoming a serious shipbuilding power. It requires some of the things he talked about to be solved, particularly cabotage and other things. But we need to think of ourselves as a serious shipbuilding power, because we cannot be a maritime power and a shipping power unless we have our own capacity of building ships. And there is every reason to do that. The economics works. We have the skills, we have the steel, we have the economic need for these ships, because we are ourselves an economic power. So really, it's for us to get on with it and do it. And there are old regulations and other things that need to be removed. I think we need to get on with it and do it.